Welcome to Kent ISD Literacy Leaders and Coaches Network Remote Edition. We are excited to bring you our 17th episode of the LLCN Brief. We appreciate those that are now following us on your preferred podcast outlet and excited to share that we now have about 4,100 unique listens to our previous 16 podcast episodes. These listens come from 31 different countries and 46 different states. We appreciate that you are finding value in the information we are making available for you. Thank you for continuing to share your message with those that you know will benefit from listening.
Our guests today have already helped countless educators by taking the guesswork out of how to blend best practices with the latest research while keeping students at the forefront of reading instruction. This episode will provide opportunities to reflect and re examine our beliefs about teaching reading. I'm Sarah Shoemaker, Early Literacy Coach at Kent ISD.
And I'm Mark Raffler, Educational Consultant in English Language Arts and Social Studies with the Kent ISD. The conversation about learning to read and teaching beginning readers has long included various viewpoints. In recent years, these conversations usually include the mention of balanced literacy and the science of reading. As this educational jargon surfaces, we learn what each of these viewpoints mean and how they are used to teach individuals how to read. Educators often feel they need to see the differences in these terms and choose a side, so to speak. The question arises, how do we go about having these conversations with the goal of building understanding to make sure that we implement classroom practices that align with what students need in order to most efficiently learn to read?
That is a great question. This topic continues to be a point of conversation for local educators as well as educators around the country. Today, our guest, Dr. Jan Burkins, will join us for an in depth exploration of this topic. Based on the book they co authored, Shifting the Balance 6 Ways to Bring the Science of Reading into the Balanced Literacy Classroom. In this text, their focus is on small shifts in instruction to position all students in a place for more successful reading experiences.
We are honored to have Dr. Jan Burkins joining us today. Dr. Jan Burkins is a full-time consultant and author of 7 books for literacy educators. With her writing partner, Carrie Yates, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, launched the Shifting the Balance book series. The first book in the series, which is about bringing the science of reading into the balanced literacy classroom, was an instant bestseller and is celebrated for the ways it makes translating the science of reading into practical, high-leverage routines. The second book in the series, which is also co-authored by Katie Egan Cunningham, does the same work for upper elementary teachers. With more than 30 years in education, Jan's experience includes 8 years as a classroom teacher, 8 years as a site-based literacy coach, as well as a reading interventionist, a regional language arts consultant for the state of Georgia, and a district literacy leader. Jan's favorite work is conducting literacy audits, helping school and district leaders determine their next steps for making learning to read easier for the children they support. And of course, Jan, on a personal note, is the mother of 4 sons and lives in Georgia with her husband, 2 youngest sons, and her high needs rescue pup, Dolly. So, Jan, thanks for joining us today.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Sarah and Mark.
We appreciate the title of the book, Shifting the Balance 6 Ways to Bring the Science of Reading into the Balanced Literacy Classroom. You talk in the book about putting both balanced literacy and science of reading practices into a classroom. How do you arrive here? And how are you able to think through this?
That's a great question. So, we really deliberated over the word that we would use to describe what we were recommending. We wrestled and wrestled with a lot of options and even talked to our editor and eventually landed on the word shift over words like change or rethink or redo, because shift captures that idea you're referring to, that idea that we're not talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're talking about refining some practices holding on to some practices, and then others do, in fact, really do need to be traded out. And so, looking critically and open heartedly and honestly at where our practices did and didn't line up with the science of how the brain learns to read became the work. These days, as we go into classrooms, it's you could walk into a classroom and identify markers and say, that really came out of the science of reading movement or community or whatever you want to refer to it as. And then you might see other things and think, yeah, that like resonates with what we've been doing for a long time in terms of language development, having deep conversations about text. The truth is, while there's some things that are diametrically different, there are also a lot of things that are shared understandings. And it's not a complete revamping of everything. And we felt like the word shift captured that idea, so we wanted to hold on. Our audience really was, when we first started writing, balanced literacy educators. What we realized is it required being kind of bilingual. What one group might refer to as one thing, another might refer to that very same thing as something else. There's some bickering over it, but really we could be on the same page a lot more. Not to say that there aren't differences in opinion. We wanted to really do more bridge building and more translating and support teachers in thinking through how to kind of step into a space, acknowledge what needed to change, appreciate what was already solid, and even bring in research that said, you've been doing this, but maybe you weren't aware of the research that says this is really sound. That's how we landed on the idea of shifts.
So you were talking about bridge building and acknowledging what is solid and appreciating that, but also recognizing what needs to change because it might not be aligned with what we know about how the brain works.
Absolutely. There's some really clear places where what we've been doing has been based more on intuition and maybe some assumptions we've made just from watching kids. But some of those really actually make learning to read harder. But then there are some other things that are by and large solid and that we need to keep doing, or we maybe even need to do more of. We use kind of a cleaning out your closet metaphor in the book that Carrie and I wrote with Katie. It's this idea that some things, they're kind of staples and we want to keep them when we're cleaning out our closet. And other things, we need to kind of revision and maybe pull in some other pieces that will make it work. And then there are other pieces, that thing that we thought was a good idea to buy that actually we've never worn and it's actually a little ridiculous. Those can go. So it's a little like cleaning out your closet.
Thank you for that. We're excited to hear more. I think this is a really welcome conversation in the literacy community, and the bridge building and this shared understandings are an important part of that conversation.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that clarification around that terminology of using the term shift and how you use that so intentionally. On that note, the first shift in the book is rethinking how reading comprehension begins. This may be surprising to some listeners or readers. So tell us the background of starting your work in this place.
Okay. Well, like you said about the title being really intentional, the placement, as you must have suspected as you were crafting this question, the placement of language comprehension as the first step in reading comprehension, putting that at the beginning of the book was, of course, very, very intentional. As opposed to some other books that we've written or been involved with, they may have, in most cases, you could have gone in and said, oh, look at the table of contents and jump in wherever it piqued your interest. But in this book, the ordering of the chapters is very purposeful and it's cumulative. So if you were to look at the table of contents at shift 4 and think, oh, I'm interested in high frequency words, and think that you want to start there, it's not going to mean nearly as much. You're not going to have as much clarity around the why behind what we're recommending for shift 4 if you don't start with shift 1. And so shift 1 is at the beginning for a number of reasons, one of which is language is the railroad track that word reading runs on. And spoken language, ideally for readers, that spoken language, which we're acquiring our entire lives from infancy through adulthood, that language enables reading comprehension. Because being able to listen to and understand spoken language, that's how the brain comprehends. It comprehends via the listening comprehension mechanisms in the brain. The brain doesn't know whether I'm reading or listening to speech. Listening comprehension, language comprehension, there's some subtle differences in those two, but that is critical for reading and generally speaking, all through elementary school, not just generally speaking, actually, all through elementary school, that language needs to be out ahead of children's word reading skills. So that was one reason we started with language comprehension, because that's what comes first when you're learning to read. Another reason is, I mean, it's hard to argue what's most important. You'll pick a fight if you start saying this is the most important part. But language comprehension is, because we learn language our entire lives, for us, well, I'll say for me, I feel sure Carrie would say the same thing, but if I had to pick one area to work on for a child and couldn't work on others, if I had to suspend work in one area, I would suspend work on the code if I had to do that to work on language comprehension, if they were also having difficulty with language, because fortunately, we don't have to make those choices. That's very contrived. And I'm not suggesting that we do just one or the other. But language comprehension is cumulative. And if you get behind, it is harder to address in many ways. Whereas the code is finite. There are only so many sounds. There are only so many ways to spell those sounds. It's pretty meaty in English, right? Because of our deep orthography, but there is a lid on it. Like, you're not going to work on learning the code your entire lives. You're going to learn it, and you're going to be done with it, and you're going to take it and use it. That's the second reason. And the third reason probably is the biggest reason, and it's that it was a really safe entry point. It's the research in there is solid in terms of how the brain accesses spoken language for reading comprehension. We felt like it would be a reasonable place for those who were interested in promoting the science of reading with balanced literacy teachers. But we also felt it would be very, very safe for educators who were just dipping their toes into the water of making some shifts, because it talks about things like read aloud and turn and talk and classroom conversations and getting parents talking with kids, and nobody is going to fight over it. This is a less contentious place, and making shifts here take less persuasion, right? I mean, much of it is going to feel familiar and safe and even already in place. So that's why shift 1 is where it is. But it does carry very foundational understandings for how the brain learns to read. So even though softer in terms of a safe entry point, it's very meaty in terms of critical science that has to be understood all the way through the rest of the book.
Thanks for laying that out there. The railroad track analogy fits not only for it as a topic, but then it as a part of how you're using the book.
Yeah, yeah. And if that track runs out, so like if I'm a first grade teacher, the language comprehension work that I'm doing is laying track ahead for the train to come through in second grade. And so when we see children who have reached third or fourth grade and they have decoding skills in place or word reading skills in place, but they lack comprehension, theoretically, it's likely that they have run out of track, right? They don't have the language to understand the words that their brain is hearing, because the brain is hearing those words read, even if we're reading silently.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about the cumulative piece, and whatever people may think around the Common Core state standards and those pieces, but it really brought attention to that being an ongoing process and not also being finite, as you suggested toward the
Right.
code piece, but like there's these pieces that do continue on, which is what really is that key to that adolescent literacy success that moves forward.
Absolutely.
So good points, and thanks for your insights on that. And yeah, we were definitely leading into that with that question because we were wondering really why. So that answer was informational for us as well. Thank you.
Oh, good. Good.
In the book, Shift 2 suggests recommitting to phonemic awareness instruction. What might this look like, Jan?
Well, we as we've been talking, we all those words like recommitting, we really put a lot of thought into. Phonemic awareness instruction, most of us went through a time when awareness instruction was front and center. It was quite the rage, quite the buzz. But what kind of evolved from that is that phonemic awareness instruction oftentimes we knew it was important, but what oftentimes happened was we were kind of anchored in a paradigm that it was this continuum that children had to meet these certain skill thresholds in order to arrive at the place where they were listening for phonemes and words. So they needed to be able to hear how many words were in a sentence and how many syllables were in a word, and the rhyme and the onset rhyme, or they needed to be able to just rhyme in general. So we read a lot of rhyming books, and it was much later that we felt like, oh, now they're getting to the phoneme level. The other thing that was a manifestation of that wave, or that time when phonemic awareness got a lot of attention, this was when the National Reading Panel study came out. Linnea Airy did a meta-analysis of phonemic awareness. Another thing that kind of grew out of that was this kind of potluck approach to it. Like, rather than any real intentional structure or scope and sequence or real understanding, it was kind of like, I bought this book and it has 101 phonemic awareness activities, and here I like to read these books because they have great rhyme and children respond with the rhymes, and everybody kind of comes together during some kind of planning time, all the kindergarten teachers or all the first grade teachers, and pulls in whatever is the most fun or the most interesting or the most engaging. And it became kind of, yeah, we're teaching phonemic awareness, just not super intentionally, and not with real insight into how the brain, which is not wired to hear phonemes. Like, the brain is wired to acquire language. That's why from birth we're doing it. There are dedicated parts of the brain that are constantly, as I'm talking right now, those three language processing mechanisms in your brains are doing the thing, right? Like, they're engaging with comprehending the language. But to read and take that spoken language into its tiniest parts, the phoneme, that is really hard for the human brain. We don't have any mechanism for that. What we do is we rewire the part that listens for meaning and ask that phonological processing system to ignore the meaning for a minute and tune in to the, for the most part, meaningless sounds within a word. So now we've given this part of the brain an extra job, a job that it's not wired to do. So it's kind of the difference in using your dominant hand and your non-dominant hand, right? This is harder for the brain. And not only have we given it a new job, we've not let go of the old job. We've said, now you have two jobs. One's a bit harder. You like the other one better, but you also need to know when to do which job, right? And this is what we're asking our 5 and 6-year-olds to do. We need to be really explicit. We need to be really planned. We need to have a sequential approach. And what the research of late, Susan Brady's work, is really kind of central to this idea. The trajectory for learning phonemic awareness is not hierarchical from like word awareness and rhyme awareness, those larger phonological skills, but it's hierarchical to where in the word the phoneme is located. And so, sure, it's fine to still do rhyming things with children, but kindergartners are going to want to rhyme, but we're not going to wait for children to master rhyming before we now do syllable work. And we're not going to wait for syllable work to fall into place before we shift to thinking on the phoneme level. We want to get on the phoneme level on the first day of kindergarten, the first day of preschool. The phoneme to start with is that initial phoneme. Then the next thing that children begin to hear is the final phoneme. The third thing in kind of the learning sequence the developmental sequence is the medial sound, which is a vowel. And then finally, those internal consonants in a consonant blend. So if the word is wild, hearing that L in wild, that's one of the hardest things to hear. So, and the other thing that is different is that a lot of talk about phonemic awareness, and this is true, like the definition of phonemic awareness is that it's about hearing the sounds, right? It's not about written grapheme. It's not about the graphemes. However, what we know is that those graphemes help the brain remember the sounds. We want to connect the sounds to sound spellings early in the process as well. So this idea that we have 40 minutes of phonemic awareness instruction and it's all auditory is also problematic. We want to show kids how the sounds line up to the graphemes. So those are two of the biggies. And I think it's easy to overcorrect. If a little bit of phonemic awareness work is good, then a whole bunch of it must be great. And so it becomes really important. I mean, what the research shows is that once you've got it, you've got it. And in fact, more phonemic awareness instruction diminishes reading outcomes. We don't want every third grader getting 20 minutes of explicit instruction phonemic awareness. We need to know what children know, and a quick and easy way to know something about children once they're in first or second or third grade is to look at their writing, because their spelling will indicate which sounds they can hear, even if it's the wrong grapheme, even if it's the wrong sound spelling. Whether they've represented each sound will tell you. If they're all, if they hear the initial sound and the final sound but not the medial sounds, then you know where they are in that progression. So it's more intentional.
Oh, helping us focus on so many pieces here, but really thinking about not what is the hierarchy of phonemic awareness or what are the fun or engaging activities, but how do we get to that phoneme level and how do we make sure that we're linking the graphemes with the phonemes? We used to say phonemic awareness is something you could do in the dark, but we're learning from research that that's not helping the connections form in the sight and the hearing rounds,
Right.
and that linking those two things is going to be most beneficial to children.
Absolutely. Yes. And fortunately, it's not hard to find ways to teach this with children that are both fun and meet the criteria for attending to the progression that the brain follows, right, as it's becoming more and more aware of phonemes.
Thank you for that emphasis
Sure.
on being intentional and going back to the research and saying, what does that say?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Long considered a foundational skill, phonics instruction tends to be at the core of reading conversations in the chapter on reimagining the way we teach phonics. You address the misunderstanding of phonics is boring, and we certainly hear a lot about that. So please tell us more.
Yes. Yes. This misunderstanding, I think it harkens back to, well, for many of us, back to when we were children. it was boring for us, perhaps. It's not unusual to assume that if we didn't like something, then nobody will, or it's bad for children. But I think it also comes out of that period in literacy history when reading groups were something that were commonplace and they weren't fluid at all. It wasn't so much about differentiation that was flexible. It was kids really locked into some groups. And oftentimes, the instruction that the bluebirds got was very different than the instruction that the buzzards group got, right? And so if you're in the buzzards group, you may have just been doing skills worksheets, right? Whereas if you're over in the bluebird group, you've got some kind of lovely beginning reading book and you're talking about it and sounding like a reader. And those are viable concerns. I think out of that grew whole language, which was an overcorrection, but there it was pushback on this idea that particular groups of children were kind of locked into these gateway performances and they would get stuck in really boring, really tedious drills that didn't necessarily impact their reading. However, we have to teach the alphabetic code. I mean, if we want children to be proficient readers, because navigating the code is not something that our brains learn easily, the argument has been made to kind of work around it and rely on context and do some other things. However, those are not sustainable for readers. Eventually, they're going to hit a wall and they're going to need interventions, and it becomes really jarring to their self esteem. It's like it looks like it's working, but then it falls apart later. Phonics instruction can be engaging. We see lots of engaging phonics instruction going on out there. We also see some, it can also still be very boring. And this is a place where the concerns are valid. And I think that's one of the things we really wanted to do with our work is not dismiss the concerns. And it's true, a lot of the responses to how phonics instruction can be boring are around the idea that it's a code and children love to solve a code. That is true. Like learning to decode can be super fun and super exciting. But I mean, there can be boring and arguably ineffective phonics instruction still. It's not intrinsically going to be super engaging for kids. I mean, we watch teachers do amazing things with their phonics instruction because they're creative and they're passionate. I'll say this much, if we believe that it's boring, it's going to make it a lot harder for us to engage students and be creative with it. There is some hard work associated with it. Like we think of this as kind of the core work. If you're thinking about getting in shape, it's the part we like least. But if you're getting in shape and you're not doing anything for your core, you're not actually getting in shape. And if you're reading and you're not learning how the code works, you're not actually reading. You might be saying the words on the page because there's a picture that matches, or you might be relying on context as a compensatory strategy, but eventually it's going to be problematic for you. I think it's true. It can be boring, especially if children need to do a lot of practice of something. I think also the argument that every brain learns to read the same way, which is also true. Our brains engage the same mechanisms, but memory and working memory for children's memories may vary. So some children need less practice than others. And if every child in the class is practicing as much as a child who has dyslexia, for example, long past when they already know a skill, then that's probably going to be boring for that student and also not appropriate in terms of differentiation. There's truth on both sides of the conversation, and it's we try to stay curious. Like, yeah, what's the truth here? Absolutely. the same mechanisms are in place, and everybody needs phonics instruction. Once they've got it, do they need to keep doing it and keep doing it? Or does that mean they can, they need to do worksheets? Lots and lots of worksheets? No, it does not mean that. I mean, one of our favorite examples is interactive writing, which is so authentic, so integrated, so powerful, really brings together the language comprehension, and you can tailor it to practice whatever phonics skills you're working on. Bring in phonemic awareness, bring in teaching orthographic mapping with high frequency words. And so that's just an example of how, there are powerful ways to approach phonics. But again, it's got to be explicit, it's got to be systematic, it's got to be cumulative, it's got to focus on what kids know. We're concerned when we see whole groups of first graders at the end of first grade doing review drills of the sounds that go just with the letters of the alphabet for a number of reasons. But one is probably most of those children have that at that point, and that's time that could be better spent and be more engaging. So all of these answers to these questions are rather layered and nuanced and multidimensional. So they're long answers.
No, that's, I think, part of what's intriguing in, just even in the title of the book and carrying us forward. And so you have amazing analogies that you share that really are connecting. And I can see Sarah feeling the same way and continue with that too, right? Like you really hit on things. I think a lot of times there's a perception of what that instruction or what that experience is up to and including if we all said, hey, let's do a core workout right now, we'd all go, oh, no way. But we're saying it's still necessary to do.
It's still
So the code is
necessary.
necessary. It
Yeah,
has main tenets that we need to keep in mind. However, there are ways that we can make it more engaging, more fruitful, more opportunistic for students to grasp and learn and move forward with. So I think
absolutely.
so you're walking through these pieces, I think, in a way that helps make more sense. And I think it's also supportive that you're acknowledging both pieces of the conversation, but yet hitting on the pieces that seem to work the best to move forward.
That core work, when you work with a coach, the coach doesn't say, or a personal trainer, the personal trainer, when you say, ooh, I don't like sit-ups or crunches or whatever it is that the coach, they say, oh yeah, I know, do them. Right? I mean, we have to let kids do this work, or it's for their best interest. So, but if there's some music and there are some ways to get at your obliques that are more fun than others, or then we've got to find those ways.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
We have all heard various terms and seen various practices related to word learning in the classroom. Sight words, high frequency words, word walls, word lists. One of the chapters in your book clarifies the difference between sight words and high frequency words, and then points us to high frequency word instruction. What is the important to note in the area of revisiting high frequency word instruction?
Well, Sarah, shift 4 is a really powerful one, and one of our favorites. I mean, picking a favorite shift is a little like picking a favorite child. You're not supposed to do that, but it is a favorite because it's doable, and there's less to fight about in this shift. And it's an eye opener. It's a safe place to begin making changes to more brain friendly instruction, because most of us we're already frustrated with the ways that we teach high frequency words, and have not felt like, oh, kids really are nailing these and getting these, and especially the irregularly spelled ones, which are those are the ones that we really need to talk about. Many of us, we've resorted to flashcards long ago. Flashcards have long been accepted, even in classrooms where we have considered ourselves aligned with more authentic ways to learn things. Just kind of that drill and memorize approach has been a very mainstream for what we do. But additionally, we've been chanting the letters, we've been using shaving cream and sticky wicky and fruit scented magic markers, and all for children to like try and learn these words. And then, they end up in third, fourth, fifth grade, and you look at their writing, and these are the same words they've been working on since first grade and second grade, and they're not spelling them correctly. We already had some pain points around high frequency word instruction, and we'd even begun like passing this work off to parents, right? Like parents get this long list. Your child's got to know these lists of words automatically by Christmas. And then it's like, and so some of the hardest work, Mark, you may have I'm seeing you nod, you may have a child, you had that happen, I'll bet.
And as a first grade teacher, I sent those lists
Oh,
home myself. So yes, I definitely
yeah,
relate.
absolutely. Absolutely. So send all that like hand wringing and children crying and all those spellings that seem so illogical home for them to wrestle with. It's not great for the the parent-child relationship or even the school-family relationship. We were ripe for change. The shift is really understanding that irregularly spelled high frequency words, that actually we have to continue to focus on the sounds and the spellings, that actually we can do sounding out work on those words. I know that sounds crazy if it's the first time a listener's hearing that, but we want children thinking about how those words are blended. And because the brain does not remember words as whole visual pieces. And that's the way we've been teaching children to remember them. We've been teaching them to just memorize them visually as units. And the brain just cannot do that with very many words, like just a few words. And then I'm going to have to forget one to remember a new one, which is what we see, right? With kids. It's like, oh man, high frequency words have long been kind of the bane of our existence, the bee in our bonnets. Learning that we can teach children, that we can scaffold their awareness of the alphabetic principle and show them, make concrete the very abstract process of lining the phonemes, which we talk about in shift 2, those individual sounds with their graphemes, that each of those sounds has a particular spelling. Now, in those irregularly spelled words, the spelling might be unexpected. So if you take a word like was, an S spelling Z is not highly irregular, but if I'm in kindergarten, that's going to feel a little bit different. But just noticing that and noticing that in the word was, that Z sound is spelled with an S, that's the work of orthographic mapping. So we want to support children in thinking about, when I say the word that, that, there are 3 sounds. And now if I show children the spelling for the word that, we know that there are 4 letters to spell those 3 sounds. So obviously, a couple of those letters are going to work together. The A will be easy to figure out. The T will be easy to figure out. So the V must be spelled with TH. Elkonin boxes, magnetic letters, those are great for the initial stages of teaching children orthographic mapping. But 1 to 4 experiences of lining phonemes with graphemes will lock that word into memory. And when I say children learn the word in 1 to 4 experiences, typically developing children will learn the word in 1 to 4 experiences, I mean learn it, learn it. They can read it. They can write it and spell it correctly. They can use it in context, as opposed to, here we are, here's this flashcard, I'm going to hold it for 4, 5, 6 seconds while you think about it. We want children, they have to be able to read it in less than half a second eventually, which is what you're able to do with 50,000 words. And certainly you didn't memorize all of those 50,000 words visually. Scaffolding orthographic mapping is a game changer. And once kids know it, Once they understand it, they begin to utilize it as they are teaching themselves words. So when I first encountered the word macabre in print, my language came first, knowing that word in speech. That was my railroad track. But then when I see it in print, I've got the context to tell me it means what I think that means. That must be macabre. Is that really macabre? Because it's spelled with a BRE at the end. So in that word, the sound B is spelled BRE. There's a silent R, silent E. I can go and line up those spellings with the sounds. And that is what you have done as proficient readers. Every word that you really know, you have done that work. It became rather automatic for you, and maybe nobody explicitly showed you or scaffolded you with that. But that's how you remember words. It's a big, magical, amazing shift. Really, really fun and exciting.
Thank you for that. High frequency word instruction, as you mentioned, has taken on lots of forms, whether it's rainbow writing or shaving cream or flashcards, none of which we have found to be as successful as we wanted them to be, right? And so when we really think about what the research says, the orthographic mapping points us to what I remember Nell Duke saying many years ago, and she has a International Reading Association article about this. Teach sight words as you would other words, or teach high frequency words with that
Absolutely.
orthographic mapping. So the research points us that if we're doing that orthographic mapping, it doesn't take 20 flashcards of the same word. It takes 1 to 4 experiences to visualize it, to see it, to sound it out, and to know that that irregular word is now becoming decodable for those students because they're starting to recognize those other patterns that come out.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
Mm-hmm.
you.
Shift 5 is focused on reinventing the ways we use meaning, structure, and visual information in the process of reading. Educators familiar with listening to students read and completing running records have come to know this process as analyzing for MSV, or sometimes referred to as miscue analysis. You emphasize that the approach to both analyzing students' reading and instructing students within the classroom should rearrange this known model. Explain this so listeners have a better understanding of reinventing the ways we use MSV.
Well, shift 1 was at the beginning of the book because it was a soft entry point. Shift 5 is at the end of the book because it's one of the more complex and can be emotional for both sides of the conversation. It can be polarizing. And so when we wrote Shift 5, we made the decision to really lean into the language of hold on to some extent the term visual and the term meaning because those were familiar. The big idea in this chapter is a shift away from thinking of the word reading aspects of reading as strategic. And strategic in the sense, I'm not saying that someone who's decoding will never engage any kind of strategic thinking, but what I'm saying is, whereas we used to view it as there are lots of ways we can figure out these words. We could look at the picture, we could use the context, we could think about the first letter, we could skip it and come back and fill something in, or we could decode it. But the word reading piece needs to be more linear. Now, comprehension work, absolutely that is strategic. We're asking, what do I know? What have I figured out? What's changed since this sentence was added to what I read? How am I building a mental model of the text? That's a lot more like we go at a math problem. But the word reading part, especially in the full alphabetic phase when children are decoding and needing to read all the way through a word, that needs to be linear. So every time readers get to a word they don't know, that they approach it sounding it out. And I tell you that the term sound it out was a really hard one for us to work through because we had some trauma around that term. I mean, there was a period in literacy history where that term, I got called out one time in front of a group of teachers for using that term, and I haven't used it since until these days. And so it was hard, but what really made us open up to the idea that rather than coming up with lots of different ways to basically sound it out, is the idea that it's about the kids. And when you say sound it out, they know what you mean. We've got to be the grown-ups. When children encounter words they don't know, now, whether teachers are referring to the print on the page as visual information or print or the code or phonics or graphemes, I mean, yes, there are ways to be precise about that, but that is less of a sticking point for us. If children are sounding out the words and then confirming with meaning, or then checking or adjusting with meaning, then that is what the brain of proficient readers do. The drawback, or one of the drawbacks of teaching children to use whatever they can to figure out what a word is that all that helps them do is read that book in front of them. If it helps them. I mean, eventually they'll outgrow that. Like, that won't work anymore. That's going to fall apart on them. And that will probably be long beyond where it looks like it's working for them in kindergarten or first grade. And so it's much later, and the connection between that has been slow to realize that this is a contributing factor. But we want children to always decode all the way through a word, blend it together. And then we want them to go back to the beginning of the sentence and put it together so far and think about meaning. Again, we're connecting to meaning. We don't want them just decoding and just practicing that without understanding that it doesn't become reading until they bring in meaning. They may be able to say those words, but it is not reading until that meaning processing system and that context processing system come into play. They've got to move beyond orthographics. Shift 5 chapter was misunderstood by a number of people, understandably so. And we have a section on our website called Beyond the Book, where we kind of elaborate, and I don't even know where it is actually. Oh, yep, I do. Where we elaborate on some of our thinking in Shift 5, but because we knew that not all of our readers would be familiar with MSV, we didn't want to assume. We spent a couple of pages explaining it. So if someone picks up the book and turns to that, it reads as if we're teaching that, but we're explaining it in order to, on the next page, interrogate it. But we've done some writing in response to some feedback that we've gotten on Shift 5. Like I said, Shift 5 is the one that gets people really, really excited. The shift is about thinking about decoding as a linear process that is then followed up. Like, you get as close as you can by a complete blending through the word. You're not getting close by looking at the first letter, and you're not getting close by letter sampling, because if you skip over that orthography, those are the sit-ups. And so not only maybe you have read the word cat in this book because there's a picture of a cat and you know the letter C says k, and you've worked it out that way using some strategic action. But the next time you read the word cat, you're no better off. If you don't have that picture cue, you're not set up. And not only that, by not going k, a, t, you miss time for the brain to practice and notice that a, t, they come together often. So that next time when you see it again, a, t, until eventually that gets consolidated. That work of learning English orthography through the sit-ups of decoding gets missed if we don't prompt children to decode. And this includes on high frequency, irregularly spelled words, because we've always said, you can't use the phonics knowledge you have on those words because they don't follow the rules. Well, how do children know when they are in a book and they don't know any of the words? How do they know that this particular word doesn't follow the rules? The only tool they have is to decode it. in a nutshell, it's about shifting to a linear decoding focus process for word reading and aligning the practice, which is in the next shift, with what we're teaching. That again requires knowing what kids know about phonics, that they're able to practice something they know.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a lot of things that we try to speak to, and I think you further addressed even in the in working through answering that question, the idea of how the book is building upon itself as well. And you tackle this where again, falling back on word reading, being in that more linear sense, that is what it is, decoding all the way through, but you also emphasize we're connecting back to meaning. And I think a huge piece that you allude to as well is that there's more learning for us to do as well. And so you incorporate that information to allow a foundation for us to learn more. And it sounds like you've got even more learning that can occur in the beyond the book piece. And we'll be sure to include that in our show notes in a resource folder that or a page that we'll link to as well. So thanks for navigating through that and just hitting on those high points. I think that makes it clear, and it provides an opportunity for our listeners to go and get more information as they might go and need it to help them process through it, whatever they're standing on, how they're feeling about it emotionally themselves.
We did it. We made it to the success that you were just talking about, Jan. Tell us more about the text used in instruction for beginning readers, referring to decodable text specifically. What do we need to know?
Well, as I alluded to in the previous question, you want to give children opportunities to practice the phonics skills that they've been taught. However, you also want them to have something to think about. We don't want to put meaningless text or nonsensical text in front of kids. And writing text for beginning readers is difficult. It takes some real, I think, skill and talent to put together something with a limited vocabulary. These are controlled vocabulary text that still gives kids something to think about. When I was thinking about this question, I would estimate that, like, of the decodable text that we see, and this is not like hard science or anything, this is just anecdotal, maybe 1 in 4 would really meet a criteria that we would consider worth sharing with kids. And of course, they have to meet, aside from the decodability requirements, like assuming that it's a text that is built with phoneme grapheme relationships that children have been taught and need to practice, assuming that 1 in 4 is going to be excellent. There'll be a couple more that will be okay, not horrible, not great, and then there'll be 1 in 4 that'll be just like, oh, please don't use these with kids. I mean, that's a pretty high number, but you want a text that gives kids something to think about. For example, if the text reads, well, first of all, they need to have decodable text versus predictable text in their beginning reading experiences. And we're talking about what previously would have been children reading in levels A through F. I mean, that ending level is kind of, E is where text got more decodable. Like, that was where you would see kids hit a wall if they didn't have some phonics under their belts, because they were asked to actually really read and comprehend the text, whereas before they might have been kind of strategically putting it together. And so it's really those first levels that are most problematic. If you have a child who is proficiently reading in a text labeled M and they're accurate and they're comprehending, never mind whether the M label is accurate or not, there's nothing to really discuss there in terms of whether it's okay for kids to read those books. The real issue is with the beginning text. But what we look for is text where the illustration brings in another layer of depth. And we try to build it such that the illustrations maybe follow the text. Sometimes when we build a decodable text, you turn the page and there's the illustration. So you decode and then you confirm, which is what we're trying to teach the brain to do. Decode first and then confirm with meaning. But if the text reads, "The fat cat sat on a mat," if you pick up a text and there's just a picture of a cat on a mat, that's an okay text, right? Like there's an illustration that's going to be engaging. But if you pick up a text and there's a cat stretched out on a mat and someone has obviously fallen and tripped over the cat, now you have a story. You have something to engage that language comprehension around. You have something to build a mental model around. And you couldn't bring all that in with written text because it it would interfere with the kind of the formula for controlling the vocabulary for the beginning reader. And always on the lookout for texts that take things deeper and give kids something to talk about, because it's shift 6 is where it circles back to shift 1. The other thing to think about is there are 3 things to consider as we're teaching children to read and that we want to monitor as we are taking note of their progress. We want to know what they know about the code. We want to do some kind of phonics inventory so that we have a sense of their knowledge of sound spellings. We want to know that the books that they're reading in, even if they have to toggle back and forth, I'm going to decode a little bit, and now I'm going to think about meaning, and now I'm going to decode, which is what beginning readers will have to do because the brain can only do one thing at a time unless something is automatic. Till these words become sight words, I'm going to have to shift back and forth between meaning and decoding. And then the third thing is I'm a beginning reader, and these texts are very simple and very controlled. I may be in first grade, but my language development, my language work, it needs to be out there ahead of the train that's going to be coming in second grade and third grade. And so I need to be tuned in to each child's language comprehension, because a child can appear on track with reading comprehension, but they're on track because these books are so simple, not because they really have strong language comprehension. And we don't realize that the language comprehension is a problem until they get into third, fourth, fifth grade and they run out of track. But we know who these students are, the children who we know need to expand their vocabulary. They need exposure to more complex sentences. We need to build their language comprehension. They don't fall into that group that maybe gets support or services from, because they're learning English as another language. But we've got kids who don't get interventions, who need interventions around language comprehension. That's the complement to the little books. Takeaway is we need decodable texts that align with the phonics that children have been taught so that they can practice, and they need a lot of practice. They're going to sound disfluent initially, and that is the sit-ups. Sit-ups aren't pretty. And then we also need those texts to have something for them to think about. And then finally, we need to simultaneously, parallel to that work, that decoding and reading comprehension work, we need to be working on language comprehension way beyond what they can actually read, so that they're ready to comprehend when that decoding comes online for more complex text. That's shift 6.
Lots of things to consider there: the knowledge the students have of the code, the books that are supporting and aligning with that code knowledge, giving them something to think about, and challenging their language comprehension work ahead of the decoding work, so that the track, as you put it in your analogy, is laid ahead of where their decoding skills are. So when they've completed that sequence of decoding skills and understanding, there is still more comprehension and language work to do in their education, and that they're prepared for that.
Absolutely.
All right, we've asked some questions and appreciate all the expertise that you've offered. So, as we conclude this interview, what have we not asked that is important to highlight here?
I mean, I feel like we've done a I think you did a really thorough job. You were pretty systematic all the way through the book. I think probably coming back around to, as schools are digging into making some shifts, really keeping an eye on the whole reading process and being very careful not to overcorrect, and then taking care of each other in the work. It's heart work and head work. And if if your listeners want to go deeper with this, our website, the6shifts.com, has lots and lots of resources on it, including a downloads page where there are free tools for each of the shifts in both books. You can download. They're just We just made them for teachers. And then also we have online classes. We have a K2 class and a 3-5 class. And again, as I mentioned, those grade levels. If you have beginning readers and you teach fifth grade, then you may want to take the K2 class because it's about teaching beginning readers. And the same for the 3-5 class. But we have a learn at your own pace, kind of learn on demand. It's asynchronous, and Carrie is with me in those videos. And then in the 3-5, Katie Egan Cunningham joins us. Since you didn't get to hear Carrie today, and we hate that she wasn't able to join us, you may want to do the class to hear how she teaches about this stuff. And then there's also a mini course there for orthographic mapping, a mini course on how to teach high frequency words by aligning phonemes and graphemes. And it is called Sight Word Success. Yeah, lots of tools there. And if you're a district leader and you want to think about how to support this work across a district, we have a professional development specialist, Maggie Thorson, who you can write to, and she's brilliant and was a literacy coach and a classroom teacher for years and is great at helping schools think through what's the model for supporting, kind of making these shifts begin to happen in our district. Thank you, Sarah and Mark, for reaching out. I do appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness and your technology skills. And again, I want to give a shout out to Carrie, who I know really wanted to be here but just couldn't. And so I appreciate your flexibility, and we're honored to be included in your work.
Well, thank you, Jan. And the book itself, even in the title, right? It was kind of like it's a just in time resource for where a lot of educators, districts, the work and how it's moving. And so you really give some practical ways, and you walk through how to build throughout the book, and it's really some good tidbits that might be there in the book, but for you to outline it here, to hear how it flows from the beginning to the end, because honestly we all look to the table of contents and try to find the pieces that we're searching the most for. So to have those extra insights to understand how it builds. You did bring up your website with lots of resources, the online classes for opportunity to go deeper, and even that district leadership connection. We work with a lot of system level work here in our county, actually. And so that was music to my ears to hear about how you're connecting with districts potentially, but that even just that you're giving a nod to that work, or this work in general, isn't work that just happens in certain places. It happens right across an entire district, and there's a map and a flow and a sequence to it. And you're very personable. It makes it easy to listen to. And so again, we just really appreciate your insights and the things that you had to share. So thanks for you taking your time out of your day.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun. Take
Yes,
care.
thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us for this LLCN brief podcast today. We appreciate our guest, Dr. Jan Burkins. Thank you for sharing your insight into shifting the balance and its implications for classroom literacy practice. If you're looking to access the resources from today's podcast episode, please visit our electronic document, LLCN 2425 resources at bit.ly/capital L, capital L, capital C, capital N, lowercase resources 2425.
We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future. Also, we're looking for your suggestions on topics as well as questions you may have related to literacy. Please take the time to let us know what you want to learn more about through our Google form. That's found at bit.ly, that's bit.ly / capital L, capital C, capital N, all lowercase topics.
You can earn sketch credit by listening to the LLCN Brief Podcast. Podcast PDX is bite sized learning that allows you to earn sketch credit for doing something you already love, listening to the LLCN Brief Podcast.
We know you are busy. This professional learning opportunity will meet you where you are, anytime, anywhere. You can earn up to 1.25 sketch credits per episode by listening and briefly reflecting. We have made it easy to earn your credits. Just visit our podcast PDX homepage. This can be found at bit.ly / podcast PDX. That's bit.ly, bit.ly / podcast, all lowercase, capital P, capital D, lowercase x. At this homepage, you'll find 3 easy steps to take to get you on the road to earning sketch credit while listening to your favorite literacy podcast. Thank you for listening today.